Hi, everyone, and welcome to Reimagine Agriculture, the podcast where we explore the future of farming, food, and rural life across Europe through the eyes of the people shaping it. I'm Teresa Carvalho, and in this series, we'll meet people from across Europe who are reshaping the future of agriculture. In this episode, we're heading to Belgium to talk to Sophie Enroth, a PhD candidate at UC Louvain, who is researching farm labor issues and sustainable farming practices. Hi, Sophie.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research? I mean, what inspired you to explore the topic of invisible agricultural labor and its role in the transition of our food systems?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know how far I can go with this because I've always been super passionate about agriculture in general. Like since I was a teenager, I don't know what it is about agriculture, but it's such like a basic element of society. Like the agriculture was supposed to be like food production, which is so basic, and the challenges that food systems are facing are so important and also like so global and also very local. So agriculture has always been a passion of mine ever since I started to learn a little bit. Actually, I think it started when I calculated my carbon footprint for the first time when I was like 14 or 15. And I learned that actually meat consumption has a huge impact on your carbon footprint. I had no idea that my food intake had an impact on anything because I think I took it for granted the whole time. And so yeah, that really struck me. And since then, I've always been super interested. And like, for instance, when I was 17 or 18 after high school, I was very lucky to be able to travel quite a bit. I went to Nepal for a year, and there I worked in farms because I wanted to learn more about farming. Um, uh, and yeah, I think that's where I first met the issues of gender in farming, because in Nepal, at least in my community where I was living, it was mostly the women that were doing the farming. And so I was working with them all day, and I was learning slowly and slowly. I wasn't really noticing I was learning it, but I noticed like the differences in resource use. So for instance, the women, they don't manage the money, for instance. They don't also manage the buying of inputs, although they are the farmers. And so that also created quite a bit of challenges because the husband would buy the inputs at the market and then come back with inputs, and then sometimes the women were like, well, this is not what we need. And also bargaining power, etc. And that's also where I learned about how gender inequalities could also impact the environment. Because what I was noticing with my colleagues, the women I was working with all day, is sometimes they didn't follow the instructions on the inputs labels. Because I could read English, I could read that you have to like dilute these inputs in like, I don't know, 2 liters of water and then spray 1 liter of this solution on 10 square meters or something. And I was noticing that they were not using the inputs in that way. They were like kind of sewing it and using a lot more than the instructions actually called for. And so I talked to them about it. I was like, okay, this is interesting. How come you use it this way? Is it more effective in your experience to use the inputs this way? I have no clue what the inputs were, to be honest. I don't know if it were pesticides or nitrogen. I wouldn't know. And then they told me actually they just couldn't read the label because the literacy level of women, I think, especially in Nepal, is pretty low. And so we created like discussion groups with these women to talk about this and to be like, okay, how can we make this information more available? And so we basically recreated a WhatsApp group so that the women could also share some of their experiences. And I didn't know that I would be studying this in a scientific way later on. I had no clue. I didn't even know what research was at that point. I was just like 18, living, trying to chat with people. And I learned so much. When I came back, I studied bioengineering very naturally. I always knew I wanted to do like agronomy, so I did agronomical sciences. And that led me to my master's thesis and my journey in research on gender and the adoption of farming practices. And so the echo that did to my experience in Nepal was super interesting because I didn't know how interesting it was what I was seeing there. I didn't know how special it was. So now, with my supervisor, Goedele van den Broek, we are investigating labor issues in general. So I did a master's thesis in the first study on gender and how the gender of farmers influences their adoption of sustainable farming practices. And that led us to actually consider invisible labor as a whole, because when we talk about invisible labor, we talk about basically women farmers and farm workers. These are the two main categories of people that are called invisible workers, depending on who you talk with, women farmers and farm workers. And they both have a very important role to play in the future of farming systems because they are taking more and more space. So there's more and more women farmers taking over farms. And also like the workers are more and more prevalent in European workforce in general. I think that's the journey that led me to this PhD, and I feel like also the responsibility of investigating these topics is huge because I base my work a lot on interviews and testimonies of farmers, and I really feel the weight of having to represent them in an accurate way. It's a blessing to have this responsibility because I absolutely love this job, and I love to work on these topics that are super dear to me and I think are so important as well. But it's also a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, that's a really important point, the one that you're making, the importance of gender. I mean,
Yeah.
gender really is important to, I feel, every industry and something that's not discussed
Mm-hmm.
enough, like the impact of gender in absolutely everything. And I think that's, a really important point that's also missing from the wider sustainability discussion. When labor becomes invisible, it doesn't just distort the data, it influences how policies are made and how value is shared, and also across the entire food system. So
Yeah.
the CAP increasingly recognizes the importance of people and communities in achieving sustainability. From your perspective, why is it essential to consider the social side and not just the environmental or economic dimensions of the agricultural transformation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very loaded question. I think first thing, it should go without saying that social sustainability has to be part of what we take into account when we make policies. It should go without saying. I think especially for Europe, where we have this huge agricultural policy that takes up like a third of the budget and influences the whole continent or like the whole community of the EU that much. It's also a question of like which values do we hold as a European community? What do we want? And with all of this influence that we have, institutional influence, what are we going to do with it? And I think for Europe especially, it's also like really a question of values. But also more practically, the transition moving forward, I'm not going to say it's going to be difficult, but there's a lot of challenges. If we want social justice and we want it to be efficient, we need people to be on board and we need to make this transition, if not desirable, at least acceptable. And I think that's what we're struggling to do a little bit. Um, and also, in general, when we study gender in farming systems, what we notice, like the big summary, is gender discriminations make the transition less effective. This costs us actually quite a bit. If you have people that have less access to some resources, it's less efficient. If you didn't even care about people, actually, if you only cared about the environment or the economy, still, you would have to care about social sustainability because it's an important part of it. So so yeah, it makes so much sense. But when you think about it, how can we actually sell this to people? It seems very evident. But it's true that social sustainability is always overlooked. And when we look at like even in science, like if you look at research, social sustainability is often like a little paragraph at the end of a paper, or it's one slide at the end of a presentation. It's in many ways, although I do think it's being increasingly recognized.
So you're looking closely at gender, which adds another crucial layer to understanding how farming systems operate. Promoting gender equality in the agricultural sector is another core ambition of the CAP. Across the EU, only about 30% 58% of farm managers are women, and among young farmers under 35, that figure drops to just around 4%. So, when it comes to everyday life on farms, how do gender roles and dynamics play out in Wallonia? Are there
Yeah.
patterns or trends that might surprise people?
Yeah. So that's super interesting. So when we did our study on gender of farmers and their farming practices, so to study this, what you can do is you can take farms of women, take farms of men, and compare them and see which adopt these practices more than the others. But that's what we decided to not do. That's also super interesting. That's very interesting. And there's a ton of very interesting research on this. But what we decided to do is rather than looking at the outcome of decision making processes, we looked at the whole decision making process. And so we investigated how gender influences all steps of decision making of farming practices. And what we notice is basically gender influences all of the steps of decision making, almost all of the steps. So it influences the training levels that you have, it influences the age at which you take over a farm, it influences which farm you take over, it influences your attitudes and the norms. So, for instance, if you take gender norms, and social norms. If you compare the gender norms of women and men, it's very interesting because that echo practices quite a bit. So traditional values or norms that are associated with masculinity are strength, power, autonomy, and that really echoes conventional farming. So the fact that they're gonna maybe use, I don't know, dangerous pesticides because they are strong and they should not fear the effect these pesticides can have on their health, although they do have a very negative effect on their health. If you talk with men farmers, talking about the health impact of their pesticide use is a huge taboo because it's this tension of, yeah, we have a family history in my family of farming with diseases that are linked to pesticide use. That's also being increasingly recognized. I know I use dangerous pesticides and I'm scared of being sick as well, but I cannot show this because I have to stay strong and I have to stay like a bit on top of things and in control and not ask for help, which has also like a very negative effect on their mental health of men. So when we talk about gender norms, it's also masculinity that we have to think about. It's not only femininity. Then looking at women, feminine social norms are more associated with caring about children's health, also like their husband's health. So usually in the farms we interviewed and we investigated, it's often the women that also like tell their husbands to be careful when you use the products, etc. Very traditional social norms that have been investigated maybe a bit more. So for instance, when you look at ecofeminism, we talk about how gender norms echo environmental values. Very interesting. However, that's not the whole story because social norms are one part of what influences practices and behaviors. And there's also all of the structural context that also influences this. So, for instance, influence on how you relate with other farmers. As a woman farmer, you might not get the same respect out of your peers. So, the women farmers we interviewed often don't go to farmers groups meetings, although they are super important for farmers because that's where you meet your peers. That's where you get a lot of very important information. That's where you learn about the new technologies that are coming out. That's also where you create like a network and a support network. And women usually stay away from these meetings, which also like has an impact on how they manage their farms. And then when you look at institutional factors, actually, it's the only level where we didn't see a difference in the farms. So at the institutional level, we didn't see differences in access to subsidies or access to land between the men and women farmers in our sample. However, that's not to say that there's nothing to be said about institutional factors and gender, because there's a lot to say. But it means that in the specific context of field crops, institutional factors are maybe not as direct as the other factors, such as the farmers' groups and the social norms and the training levels and the type of farm you have, for many reasons. But like if you look at institutional factors, if you look at the CAP, for instance, The CAP has included gender equality in some ways in the 2023-2027 CAP, but it was very limited. So when you look at what was implemented, it's actually mostly data collection efforts towards gender equality. But data collection isn't an outcome, it's a means to an outcome, but it's not like an actual objective. We don't really care about the data. We care about what the data can help us do in the future. And also, gender equality was not required in the national strategic plans, which is also like a huge weakness of how gender equality was implemented in this CAP. And also, how gender is considered in the CAP right now, it's mostly a numerical representation. So the structural gender discriminations are not really talked about or not really recognized in this CAP. It's mostly numerical. So it's mostly like how many women do we have and how can we make these numbers equal? That's interesting, but that's not the whole story, because it's also like how access to education, to credits, to land, etc. When you start looking at gender and how it affects the lives and the experiences of farmers, it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's still quite a bit of progress to be made in
For
achieving gender
sure.
equality. But it's encouraging to see how, awareness and policy support is growing. The CAP does offer, programs and subsidies designed to help women enter and stay in the agricultural sector. But do you know if there are any examples of initiatives in Bologna that have helped improve labor conditions or promote gender equality on farms?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the biggest one was legal statuses. Um, so to understand this, I think we have to go back a while. But bear with me. It's been like 10,000 years we've been doing agriculture. And in these 10,000 years, we have had many revolutions, many evolutions in the tools and in the technologies that we have. And in these 10,000 years, we were able to multiply productivity levels by around 10. So at first, it was like one person can manage 1 hectare and have 1 ton of cereals as output per year. That was the productivity level of one person. And then as we were able to use metal to create tools and to like create trolleys and carts, we were able to move stuff around. We were able to put animals in stables, which helped us like get manure that we could use on crops. And that was like a huge, huge revolution. And that was a tenfold increase in these 10,000 years. And then if you look at the 50s, so that was like 75 years ago. That's not like such a long time ago. But if you look at the 50s, we started having tractors. And a tractor in and of itself isn't anything new. It's like something with power that can drag tools behind it to help you do like plowing, for instance. It's not super new, but the amount of productivity this helped us gain is phenomenal. So in 10,000 years, we were able to multiply productivity by 10. And with the tractor, we went up to 200. So now with the tractors, one person is able to cultivate like 200 hectares of land and come up with like 2,000 tons of cereals per year. That's changed how we farmed completely, because before farming was a collective task. It was something you did with your family, with your community. Like harvesting cereals, that was a huge task that had to be collective. But then with tractors, work could become individual. And so with tractors, it was possible for one person to do most of the farming. And so that meant that in a family, you had someone that had to manage the tractor and someone that had to manage the rest. And because women were responsible for domestic tasks and caring of children, for instance, that meant that the women stayed near the house and the men went outside of the house to work in the fields. And so that's how now gender roles are divided in most farms. It's the women, they take care of the animals or the administrative burden and also the domestic tasks, and the men usually go out in the fields. That's how the gender roles are separated. When these two like new professions were created, one of them we had a name for, the one with the tractor, we called that farm manager. And the other one, we didn't know how to call it. And for a while, there was no name to describe women farmers' jobs. So we didn't know how to call it. And so women farmers in the 20th century were not recognized, not even by a name. So they were considered to be housewives, kind of. They were considered to be without job, even though they were working all day. And so that means you work all day to create value for a farm that's not in your name. And it also means you don't have access to social security. You cannot leave your home. Like if you live in an abusive family as a woman farmer, you have nothing because you don't own anything. And so in the 90s and early 2000s, the legal status of helping spouse was created, which means that now women under that status have access to pension and basic social security rights. But that happened like 20 or 30 years ago. That's super recent. And still, these statuses aren't satisfactory to a lot of women. But still, I think that was the biggest thing that helped for gender equality because that also gave institutional presence to women because now we could actually also know how many there were because we had a name for them, and so they were included in agricultural census data. For instance, now we know how many helping spouse have that status in Wallonia. Before we didn't know. If you talk with farmers and you ask about their mothers and the lives of their mothers that are that generation that didn't have like these statuses, they will explain to you how difficult their lives were and how difficult they worked all their life. Not to say that men don't have it difficult either. I think men also have it very hard, for sure, in farming. Some of the men farmers also like work 80, 100 hours per week, depending on the season. I think legal status, for sure, was the biggest thing that helped grow gender equality to where it is today, which is still not perfect, but some improvements have been made, and it shows like how important it is. The institutional recognition is so important.
Thank you for these insights. I mean, these are really good examples of how local action and policy can complement each other, and closely connected to the idea of this visibility and to recognizing the different forms of labor that sustain agriculture is also the importance of collaboration, both within and across farms. So this is an essential part of today's farming landscape, and it's also a big part of what the CAP encourages. So from your perspective, what kinds of partnerships between farmers, researchers, and policymakers could help bridge the gap between policy goals and real-life labor experience?
That's a difficult question because I don't think there's a one answer. I think efforts have to be made at multiple levels. I think at the institutional level, hearing farmers' voices are super important when designing policies. It is the case in some way, but also like hearing scientific perspectives when designing policies is also important. If I talk as a researcher, I think one effort we can do as researchers is to include these voices in our analyses, even if you do economics, because like my official discipline is agricultural economics. And in economics, there's a lot of studies that are based solely on quantitative data. And I often find these quantitative studies to be interesting, but the robustness of the interpretation of this data to me always comes with interviews, qualitative analyses, and testimonies. And just including testimonies in our research, considering like as a researcher that we are one of the bridges between farmers and policymakers, we have to take this responsibility. Especially in economics, qualitative methods are often not recognized as being super interesting. They're often considered to be weak for some reason. And I think moving forward with the research using mixed methods, so both quantitative and qualitative, is super important. But that's my perspective as a researcher, of course.
No, that's a really interesting way to think about collaboration, the importance of different levels of collaboration, essentially.
I was going to say also for researchers, it's also when we design our studies that we have to go back and forth with farmers and also other actors of agricultural systems and not create like top-down, super theoretical research designs. Try and check in with multiple actors and partners along the way while we are designing our studies, I think is also crucial. And also because that takes so much energy. So As researchers, we also take like so much energy from farmers because we go there, we have interviews all the time, we ask them to fill in surveys and everything. And I think making data more available and sharing data and making data more open would just make everything so much easier, because we often do the same things. We ask mostly the same questions to a lot of people. And if we were able to share this data more efficiently, because I don't think we need to create more data all the time. We're so focused on we need more data, more data, more data. We already have a lot and we can do a lot with it. And we also like we can see the big picture of what we need to do. How many more studies do we need to confirm that we need gender equality to put it in place? For instance, if I take gender equality, but that goes with also pesticide use. How many more studies do we need to acknowledge that pesticides are an issue and we need to work on this? I think data openness could also make a lot of our research more efficient and help us actually access these voices and these testimonies.
Totally. Before we wrap up, I'd like to end on a more hopeful note. When you think about the future of Europe's agriculture, what gives you hope? What positive changes are already emerging that make you optimistic about the transition ahead?
I think what makes me optimistic is talking to farmers for sure. As an agronomist, I always love to talk about how farmers manage um, their crops and how this has changed over time. And sometimes you meet farmers with such detailed expertise in sustainable farming, and also like farmers that share this knowledge and that are like super open about it and that want to share their strategies with other farmers on how to evolve towards a more sustainable production system. And meeting these people really gives me hope, because it's also like the positive stories. Like as humans, we love stories, we love narratives, and so having like these positive stories that are told makes me hopeful that this transition can also be a positive thing for people. Also, talking with younger farmers that want to take over farms and are super passionate as well also gives me hope, because generational renewal is one of the big challenges that we're facing. So, meeting these new passionate people is also super inspiring. And I have the feeling, but I don't know how biased I am because this is what I'm studying, but I have a feeling that general people are also being increasingly interested in agriculture, food, and the challenges of food systems. I have this feeling. I'm not sure how biased I am in this vision, but I feel like this is becoming more and more a part of uh, discussions in a broader sense with people. So when I meet with friends or my family, etc., I feel like it's becoming a topic, whereas before it wasn't. And like for instance, going back to the beginning of our discussion, when I was 15, I had never thought about my food. I had never thought about it. I had never thought about like it having an impact on climate. I took it for granted, and so I think the realization that this is super important is increasing, and so that also gives me hope. I would say that's it. It's a pretty it's limited hope at the moment, to be honest. I had to search a little bit to find an answer to this question.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you for sharing your insights and for taking the time to join us today. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Reimagine Agriculture, part of the Recap Project, where we bring forward the voices helping to shape a more sustainable, inclusive, and community driven future for European farming. See you in the next episode.